Okay, in this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to the basic ideas and terms in scientific inquiry, that is, research, especially focused on how it looks as applied to issues and problems in higher education. So you can get knowledge about a question or a topic from a lot of different sources, maybe from your own personal experience, past experiences, or just your common sense from what you already know about the world and your own experiences. You can also get knowledge about a topic from tradition. So this is the way things have always been done. Alternatively, maybe you can get information about a topic from some sort of authority or an expert, Dr. Oz, somebody on TV, whatever. Or finally, another way that you can get knowledge is from science and from scientific inquiry. So we define science as a body of established knowledge that's generated using the scientific method, which I'll discuss in a second. So it's important to recognize that science refers to the process by which knowledge is generated and not a specific area of knowledge, like the biological or physical sciences. And also note that education and higher education as a field typically considers itself to be part of the social sciences. So we actually refer to ourselves as sometimes social scientists. This basically means that educational researchers have adopted scientific principles to undergird our research process. And that's also why I'm discussing this notion of science as part of our course. So following up on the second part of science, the process by which knowledge is collected, this is what this idea of scientific inquiry is. Basically, it's the way that scientific knowledge is generated, and so it's the approach to generating scientific knowledge. In other words, scientific inquiry, which is a synonym basically for research, is the search for knowledge by using recognized methods in data collection, analysis, and interpretation. So the typical steps of that process, which you probably are already familiar with from other science courses you've taken, even in elementary school, I think science classes cover the scientific method. But basically that's listed there on the screen. And that is the process that we're going to follow in this course as well. So like I said, you can get a lot of knowledge from a lot of different sources, not just from science. So how is science-based knowledge generated following the scientific method different from any other type of knowledge? So it's in a number of ways. It's important. When you use the scientific method, that allows for the replicability of findings. So we can test and retest what we believe across different settings. Maybe you're originally doing a study at Arizona State University. If you follow the scientific method, you can replicate that perhaps at another university, U of A, University of Texas, whatever. So we can test and retest what we believe and reproduce and try to replicate our findings across different settings because our procedures are set via the scientific method. In addition, using a systematic process like this helps us to better control for errors and bias in our findings. And it also helps us to determine the generalizability of knowledge claims, especially the limits to making generalizability. So in other words, when do the findings of your study apply to a situation, and then when might they not apply? And then also, one of the important things about science to keep in mind as we go forward in this course is that research audiences are able to both analyze and critique investigations that use a scientific method. That's part of the accepted process, and we will engage in critique throughout this course. So that's something that's important to think about from the start, being critical and using a critical mindset on sort of knowledge that's being generated using the scientific method. Okay, so kind of elaborating more on the point I was making in the prior slide, why not just rely on common sense? Why is knowledge generated through the scientific method considered more useful or valid in making decisions than prior experiences or the advice of others or whatever? So a final reason that I think is important, and it kind of has, larger implications for how I want you to think about research in higher education is illustrated on this slide. So sometimes it can be that how you see the world, or even how you see colleges and universities, your perceptions of those, can betray you. So specific to this example, so in this figure, which middle circle of the two graphics in the black box looks bigger? So which center looks bigger to you of those two, I guess, flower sort of looking figures? The one on the left or the one on the right? So at least to my eyes, the one on the left that's surrounded by the tiny little circles looks larger at first glance if you just look at it quickly. If I just look at it at least. But in fact, they're the same size. So my perception of what I see is affected by those surroundings and sort of the kind of other dynamics of what is going on in that graphic. And so my eyes are playing a bit of a trick on my brain. My senses are playing and can play a bit of a trick on my brain. So I see that really as an analogy to one of the challenges of doing research in higher education. So since more and more of the population has attended at least some college, pretty much everyone on the street, well, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but many people feel as though they are experts on it, and that their experiences as college students produce their knowledge base about higher education. But think about it, oftentimes the knowledge that's generated through one's individual experiences is incomplete, limited, or lacks generalizability. It can also be affected, just like this figure, by the specific setting or the surroundings in which someone has an experience. So it can be difficult, though, to convince people that studies that use procedures of scientific inquiry are better quality knowledge than their own common sense, or what one of my former professors used to call their own naive theory. So this is something that's important to keep in mind, both as you do this, as you move forward in learning about how to conduct research in higher education, and then also as you're navigating sort of your future career also as professionals, hopefully informed practitioners who now, very soon, will hold master's degrees. So it's not required at all, but this TED Talk that's linked here does a really nice job of unpacking this idea of science versus pseudoscience versus just how our perceptions of reality can betray us. And I encourage you to check it out if you have time. It's pretty entertaining and good, I think. So yes. Okay, so research, just to clarify one more time, beat it into your head. Research is using a scientific approach to collect and analyze data. So essentially that's what we're going to do in this course, learn about how to do research and design research in this course, and then actually conduct it and carry that over to your capstone project. What I'd like to highlight here is the importance of starting from a neutral position when you're doing research. So in terms of using a scientific approach, the important thing is that your mindset should be allowing data to shape your beliefs rather than starting with a preset conclusion and then trying to collect data that will substantiate your position. So really you should be allowing data to emerge or help to inform your findings, not start out by saying, this is what I'm going to find, so let me find data that will help to prove what I already think I'm going to find. So hopefully that makes sense. So then research methods, a synonym for which is your research design, which I'll talk about a lot in this class. So research methods and research design are the ways to actually collect and analyze those data. So it seems kind of straightforward, right? Hopefully I'm not being too boring here. But another thing that I want to be clear about is that there's a difference between a method of data collection, so just this idea of data collection, and research methods more broadly. So I'm foreshadowing a bit what will come in future weeks of this course, but basically a method of data collection involves what you do to collect the actual data, surprise, surprise. So that's basically a technique for physically obtaining data to be analyzed in an empirical research study. So examples of a data collection would be maybe doing an online survey or interviewing someone or conducting an observation. So a research method is broader, and it encompasses different methods of data collection as well as plans and strategies for analyzing and drawing conclusions from the data. Again, I'm foreshadowing, but some examples of research methods in qualitative research would be phenomenology, ethnography, case study research, grounded theory, historical research. Those are all qualitative. Quantitative research methods, some of you might be more familiar with these. Experimental designs, quasi-experimental designs, descriptive designs. Again, we'll discuss all of these in future weeks, but know from the start, so just doing a survey or collecting data through a survey is not research methods alone. It's part of your larger research design, but just saying, okay, my research method, I'm going to do a survey. That is actually not a total research method. It's just a piece of your overall research design. So we'll discuss this more in future weeks, but I just want to put that in your head right now. Okay, I kind of put the cart before the horse in that prior slide by using the terms qualitative and quantitative, but now I'm going to explain what those two are in a bit more detail. So they're basically the two main, what we call methodological paradigms in social science research. Basically, that's how you go about studying your topic, and also they reflect in a larger sense how you think the social world can be understood. So these are important to know about from the start because they're how the course is organized. So in weeks 3 and 4, as you might have seen on the syllabus, we'll talk about basics of quantitative research design and methods. And then in weeks 5 and 6, we'll talk about basics of qualitative research design and methods. So as this figure on the slide kind of captures, quantitative research, which is illustrated, different dimensions of that are illustrated on the left side of the figure. Quantitative research is research that relies primarily on the collection of quantitative data, which is primarily numerical. And some key attributes include this idea that both the natural and the social sciences strive for testable and confirmable theories that explain phenomena. So basically in quantitative research, there's really a focus on looking for cause and effect, trying to make predictions, and especially trying to reduce sort of like the complex social reality to variables, which I'll define in a second, in the same manner as physical reality. And so they attempt to control variables and see how other variables are influenced, etc. So basically, quantitative research is the idea that we can reduce social phenomena to variables, which are measurable constructs that represent reality. And again, I'll define variable in a second, but that's the idea of quantitative research. On the other hand, qualitative research is research that relies on the collection of data that's non-numerical, so words, pictures, video, other non-numerical data. And so in terms of the idea of this paradigm more generally and how people think about social science more broadly, it rejects the idea that we can use experimental methods like the natural or physical sciences. So this is in contrast to quantitative research, which does rely often on experimental methods. Qualitative research rejects this idea of the idea that you can do experiments in the social sciences. So qualitative scholars feel that human behavior is always bound to the context in which it occurs. So behavior has to be studied holistically. You really can't isolate with variables, cause and effect. So they often, qualitative researchers often employ an insider's perspective. It's a really personal and subjective style of research. Those of you who eventually do qualitative research projects will encounter this. So subjectivity is part of qualitative research. On the other hand, objectivity is more of a construct of quantitative research. So also I want to note that more recently, some researchers, including a number in higher education, have attempted to bridge the gap between qualitative and quantitative research. So this on the figure where it says triangulation on that bridge, and bring what's called a mixed methodological perspective to understanding social science problems. So mixed research basically involves the mixing of quantitative and qualitative paradigm characteristics on any given topic. For the most part, however, there's still the distinction and what's called, this is stupid, but what's called paradigm wars between researchers who see problems more from a quantitative versus a qualitative perspective. Essentially, these paradigms are going to guide how we learn in this course, and we'll get into further detail on each soon, but right now it's most important to understand conceptually what they are. So unfortunately, the words sound very similar, and people often get mixed up between the two. But again, and you're going to need to know this distinction for your own projects because you're going to pick one or the other, perhaps be very ambitious and try to do something mixed. But quantitative research, QUANT, focuses on numerical data and often trying to isolate causes and effects using variables. And qualitative research, QUAL, is more context-specific with a rich and deep understanding of a specific issue and takes often a more subjective, personal perspective. So elaborating a bit more on those paradigms, there are two general approaches by which researchers generate and test out theories about what's going on in the world. So in other in other words, two ways to reason about or study the social world. So quantitative research, Q-U-A-N-T, typically uses what's called a deductive approach to reasoning, which works from the more general to the more specific. Sometimes it's called a top-down approach. And then qualitative research uses what's called inductive reasoning. So this figure on the slide illustrates those two types of reasoning. So on the upper left quadrant shows the typical deductive reasoning process. So usually you begin with a theory about your topic of interest. So it could come from the literature or it could come from what someone suggests about kind of the way the world might work. So for example, Gary Becker is an economist and he proposed what's called human capital theory. You might have learned about this in your finance course in higher education. So essentially, human capital theory, and Becker, theorizes that people learn skills in education, in formal educational settings. You learn skills, and then you can then use and apply those skills to the labor market. So people who have higher levels of education, he theorized, will be more likely to get jobs, and especially higher paying jobs, because they have more sophisticated and developed skill sets that come from education. But note that theories are not necessarily universally accepted knowledge, right? So for instance, Peter Thiel is the founder of PayPal, and he doesn't agree with human capital theory at all. So he's actually paid $100,000 to kids who have really good entrepreneurial ideas. He's paid them to drop out of high school or college and pursue their ideas. Basically because he doesn't think that formal education, high school or college, will add any type of human capital or skills to what they've already got. But anyways, okay, so that's an example of a theory. Back to deductive reasoning. So the next step would be to narrow your theory down into more specific hypotheses that you could test. So using the human capital theory example, that perhaps one of many theories we could test, one of many hypotheses we could test using human capital theory is that someone with a college degree, a bachelor's degree, should be paid more than someone with only a high school degree, even after accounting their backgrounds, their personalities, their work ethics, etc., if in fact attending higher levels of education does indeed develop a more rewarded skill set. So that's an example of a hypothesis that we could develop from the theory. And then the next step in deductive reasoning is to narrow down even further and then collect observations or actual data to address these hypotheses. So I could do a survey maybe of people in Phoenix and run some models comparing the incomes of adults in Phoenix who are college educated with those who have a high school degree to test out this dimension of what human capital theory would suggest. And so ultimately, this leads us to be able to test the hypotheses with specific data and confirm or not our original theories. That's basically how quantitative researchers typically approach their studies. So they start out really broad with this idea about how something is working maybe, and then they collect data to test out whether or not their ideas that might come from the literature, from theories, from whatever, whether or not those theories actually are observed using data, or are supported or disconfirmed using data. Okay, so on the other hand, inductive reasoning is a method used by qualitative researchers typically, and that's illustrated on the bottom right hand of the slide. So inductive reasoning works the other way, moving from very specific observations up to broader generalizations and theories. So informally, we sometimes call this a bottom-up approach. In inductive reasoning, you basically begin with observing how phenomena look like in reality. So you start talking to people or observing situations, doing interviews, doing focus groups, and then as you start collecting more and more data, you start looking for patterns and themes and regularities in those settings that you're studying. And then you formulate some tentative hypotheses that you could explore, and then finally end up developing some general conclusions or even a theory. So it's basically the opposite of deductive reasoning. So in qualitative research, you start very much at the micro level, and then you move up to the macro level. So you just start talking to people, you start observing situations, you start kind of collecting data to try to identify patterns that are existing across individual cases. And then, in the other hand, deductive reasoning and quantitative research, you start at the macro and then you end up kind of collecting more micro level data to try to see whether or not that macro idea is supported or confirmed. It's two very different ways of studying the social world. Okay, so another important term that I mentioned when I was discussing the quantitative paradigm more broadly, that you'll hear often in educational research and in this course, is variable. So we'll use it a lot, and I want to make sure you know what it means from the start. So essentially, a variable is a condition or characteristic that can take on different values or categories. So most social science research involves variables. So basically, we want to understand why and how things, i.e. variables, change or vary, and what causes variables to change or vary. So by default, we often think about variables in a quantitative sense because that term is often used in statistics or math classes. But variables can actually be quantitative, numerical, or qualitative type. So essentially, again, quantitative variables change. Again, all variables change. They're not static. They can have different values. So quantitative variables change in degree or amount, while qualitative variables vary in type or kind. So they're not all quantitative. They can be quantitative or qualitative. So using some examples, think about these variables and think about whether or not they're quantitative, so varying again in degree or amount, or qualitative, so varying in type or kind. So for instance, college major, is it quantitative or qualitative? So major can be business, engineering, education. So those are all different categories or types that we can assign to college major, but they're not numbers, right? So numbers have no meaning when they're assigned to major. So majoring in a 5 has no meaning whatsoever. You could arbitrarily say engineering is 5, but that really has no meaning. So college major is qualitative variable. On the other hand, so reading test performance. So what if you had to take a reading test and I gave you, a 100% or a 75 or a 25, maybe you're not paying attention, you got a low score. So essentially all of those numbers have meaning, right? So you would rather have 100 than 25. We all know what those numbers mean. They have meaning, and you can assign numbers that have meaning to reading test performance as opposed to a college major of 75 that has no meaning. But if you got a reading test score of 75, everyone would kind of have a good idea of what that meant, right? So because those numbers have meaning, that's a quantitative variable, Q-U-A-N-T. Oops, sorry for the trigger finger. I screwed up my animation there. But anyways, okay, so dropout rate, college dropout rate from college is another quantitative variable, right? Quant. You can assign numbers to a measured dropout rate. So maybe 30% of the student body drops out of college within 6 years, or 50%, or whatever. Numerical values can be assigned. So marital status is one that sometimes can be tricky. I'm not sure why. I think because we, in our heads, assign sort of relative good and bad dimensions to marital status. But there's all different types, right, of marital status. And that word is a clue because marital status is actually a qualitative variable. So people can be divorced, married, separated, widowed, single, probably other things. But there's really no number or direction to marital status, even though we sometimes assign it in our head that we'd rather be, I don't know, married than widowed or whatever. But there really is no number. A 5 of marital status is arbitrary, and really it's the values of, or the sort of variance in the variable of marital status are all qualitative. So those are all different examples of variables because each one, again, can change across different observations. So different people or different classes or different cohorts, different individuals can have different values. That's what a variable is, some sort of construct that varies across different observations. Okay, so as I said a few slides ago, a lot of quantitative research tries to explain relationships between variables, often looking for cause and effect or making predictions. But it's important to remember from the start that when doing either qualitative or quantitative research, You have to be really careful about what type of conclusions you're drawing from what you observe. So quantitative research can be either correlational or causal. And this is also important to think about when you're coming up with your research questions, but we'll talk about that in future presentations. Anyways, so correlation versus causation. You are not able to say that your project, your research, your inquiry is testing whether or not one variable causes another variable unless you're using an experiment. And I'll talk in a few weeks about what experiments are. But you need to be very careful about saying whether or not you're going to do a project that's looking at whether or not something causes another to have an effect. Unless you're doing an experiment, you can really only talk about correlation or relationships. So this little comic is kind of hard to see, but it illustrates the dangers of assuming a correlation implies a causal relationship. So essentially, the study or the little comic strip is like, oh, there's a study that found Colorado has the lowest obesity level of any state. And the wife is like, oh, guess what? Guess what that means? And the husband's like, what? And she's like, forget about dieting. We're going to move to Colorado because Colorado has the lowest obesity level of any state. So she's sort of making this conclusion that literally crossing the border into Colorado, you don't even have to worry about anything else related to addressing obesity. Once you cross that state line, you'll start having lower levels of fatness, obesity. So anyways, that is a problematic causal jump, right? So the study is only saying there's a relationship or a correlation between living in Colorado and weighing less. So it could be that thinner people tend to gravitate towards Colorado. So being thin causes someone to live in Colorado, not that being in Colorado causes someone to be thin. We don't know what that direction is as to what's causing what. And it also does not mean that as soon as someone changes residency to Colorado, they will lose weight. There could also be some sort of third variable explanation for that relationship, right? So in other words, it could be something else that's driving that observed relationship between Colorado and having low weight levels. So perhaps the fact that Colorado has lower obesity levels could be the fact that there are tons of mountains there, so people get more exercise because they're forced to. When they go outside, they have to hike up hills automatically than flat grounds in Virginia. Well, Virginia maybe it's hilly. I don't know. Ohio, where I grew up, pretty flat. So maybe if you had the same level of activity in Ohio as if you lived in Colorado, you'd weigh the same. But, you're not burning as many calories because you're not as active. And it's just an active culture. Anyways, so all that to say, you need to be very careful about making causal claims with your research. Most likely, I've never actually had anyone do a project that's a true experiment. But hey, somebody can surprise me, so I'm not going to say never. But really likely, you'll only be able to discuss relationships between variables or correlations rather than claiming causation. So be very careful about that. So the last point I want to make in this introduction to inquiry is more philosophical and kind of more, preachy or something. But basically, it's this theme that keeps coming up a lot in higher education research. And I want it for you to keep it in mind as you begin to design your own research in this course and then also into your career. So basically, it's the idea that there's a gap that exists between what researchers, such as myself, are studying and then the type of knowledge that practitioners actually need to solve problems. So this gap between lots of researchers like me, and then people who are working in the field and trying to address issues of practice. And really what I want you to think about, and we'll talk about this more in throughout the course, but whether or not traditional research in higher education, like the studies you've read from academic journals, can really benefit you in your work. Is this research useful? And if so, how does it benefit you? And also, if it's not, why do you think it is not, and cannot benefit you? Is it because it's esoteric? It's written in a really inaccessible way? It's the questions that people are asking are sort of useless and kind of niche and don't really apply to many people's real life administrative practice. And really thinking about How can we better bridge this disconnect between research and improving practice in colleges and universities? I'm really hoping that your projects will do this, but it's something I want you to keep in mind as you consider what you might focus on in your project for this course and your capstone. Really think about a problem or issue in your own practice that would benefit from further study using scientific inquiry-based methods. And the next presentation you'll watch will help you to hone in and think more intentionally about what that topic, that problem, and those questions might be.